All right. Are we actually live? All right, cool. Very good. Well, Uneducated Economist here, going live for the first time on TikTok. We're going to see how this goes. Haven't done a live TikTok video ever. Just kind of got started on TikTok, really, posting some shorts that I cut from my YouTube channel. But I thought I would come out today and talk a little bit about the credible threat theory. Now, this is something that I have developed over the last few years and really have been the only one to discuss it to the level that I have, at least from what I can find out there. And that is the monetary policy, the real monetary policy coming from the Federal Reserve. And now, a lot of times, I'm just going to pin this in place, make sure it doesn't fall. There we go. All right. So, a lot of times when we think about monetary policy, people will think about, say, the government and their actions and what it is that they got going on. But that's not really monetary policy. Monetary policy is is coming from the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. When the government does actions, when they're spending money, when they're doing their thing, that is considered fiscal policy. So it's very important to know the difference between the two when you're looking at monetary policy as opposed to fiscal policy. And monetary policy is something that is not necessarily influenced by the politicians out there. Although a lot of people might argue with that, doesn't really matter. I got a theory that thing goes through many administrations, and it really does start telling a very clear story about what it is that is actually taking place out there. So before we get started talking about the theory, it's important to understand when the Federal Reserve is adjusting interest rates, what that means. Now, a lot of times when we think about the Federal Reserve and the adjustment of interest rates, a lot of times it's mortgages that people go to, or car loans, or something of that nature. But really, when the Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates or adjusting interest rates, what they are doing is they are adjusting something called the Fed funds. Now, the Fed funds rate, or when the Federal Reserve says we are targeting this particular rate, it's as if they wrote it on the wall saying, hey, we got this idea about where we want the interest rates to be, and it might be here at 5.25%, 5%, where we want the interest rates to be. And, it might be here at 5.25%, 5%, 2.3%, or generally it's in quarter increments. But you guys kind of get the idea behind it. And when they are doing that, it's best to understand how it is that they used to come up with this interest rate. Now, it was considered the overnight lending rate between the big banks. So if you can imagine, at the end of the day, the big banks had a reserve requirement, meaning they had to have so much on hand in order to operate the next day. And so at the end of the day, some of these banks would be in excess reserves and some of them would be in need of reserves. The ones who had excess reserves would lend them to the ones who were in need of reserves. And this overnight lending rate would be the effective fund rate. So if the Federal Reserve wanted to adjust interest rates, what they would do is buy and sell treasuries and adjust the reserves within these big banks who had a reserve requirement. And therefore, if there was a limited amount of reserves out there, then the interest rates would tendency to go up, as the banks would have to pay higher interest rates in order to acquire what would be limited, which is the reserve. So the Federal Reserve would either adjust by buying and selling treasuries or reserves off these big banks, and by doing that, they were able to adjust the levels of reserves that they would hold, and therefore get the overnight lending rate to land within the target range of the Fed funds rate. Okay. I know that was a lot. So people who are brand new to this, that might have been very, very what in the world? So again, it's pretty simple. Overnight lending rate between the big banks. They have certain amount of reserves that they are required to have. If they don't have it, they borrow it. That borrowing rate is the effective fund rate. The Federal Reserve would try to adjust that. Now, that's the old way of doing it. And it's good to know how they used to do it, because the credible threat theory goes back to 2001. I mean, it even goes back further than that, but I take it back to around 2002, actually. 2002, so 22 years ago. And this is the way that they had had conducted themselves back then. So since then, something different has happened, because during the quantitative easing of the pandemic and attempting to stimulate the economy and everything that they were doing, that over massive amounts of money printing was then moving into the banking system, which was going to increase their reserves by a huge amount, meaning that the overnight lending rate would essentially be zero and they would have no control over where the interest rates would be. So what they did is they had a zero reserve requirement to these banks and just loaded them up. And then they moved from what they called a limited reserve system into an abundant reserve system. And this abundant reserve system meant that the overnight lending rate was no longer going to necessarily work, because all these banks had plenty of reserves. So what then happened is they moved that over to the repo facility. So then when these banks had a whole bunch of money that they didn't have necessarily lending to each other, they could loan the excess reserves that they had to the repo facility and gain a little tiny bit of interest rates off of it. What does this say right here? Anyway, and gain a little bit of interest rates off of it. The other place that the banks could go is another account at the Federal Reserve, interest on excess reserves, which is it's a lower interest rates. Essentially, it would be the bare minimum in which that a bank would ever put their money in order to gain even just a tiny bit of return, and it was essentially nothing. So this is how the Federal Reserve was now conducting themselves as far as achieving the Fed funds rate, because it was no longer going to be the overnight lending rate, but now over at the repo facility. And that's how they were targeting the Fed funds, and that's how they still target it today. Okay. I know that was a lot to take on. Although even if you didn't get that part, it's okay, right? I mean, that was a lot to take. And I know I kind of talked really fast through that. But it's important to kind of understand that the Federal Reserve had interest rates that they were targeting back when they had this overnight lending rate, and some interesting things were going to happen that they knew about. And this is where I start the credible threat theory, right? Because what we have to do is we have to take this back to Ben Bernanke. You guys remember the stories of Ben Bernanke? This is the speech. Oops, no, not this one. I'm sorry. Well, that was it. Why didn't it come up? There we go. Okay. So we take it back to this Ben Bernanke speech. And this speech, let me get the title of it and the date right. This is November 21st, 2002. And now what's very interesting about this speech is that the whole speech is how to prevent deflation. How to prevent deflation from occurring here. Let me back this thing up here a little bit. That's as far back. Oh, that's as far back as it goes. Lower this down so it's not so much in the way. There we go. All right. So it was more about deflation and how to prevent it from ever occurring here. And for those of you who are wondering why I do this in the car, is because of the sound. The sound is so much better in the car than just about anywhere else you could ever do a video. So without a actual studio to do videos, okay. The car is the best place to do it. All right, here we go. So November 21st, 2002. And in this speech, he's talking about deflation and how to prevent it from ever occurring here. Now, let me get down to some of the highlighted spots I have here. And this is what he has to say. Because you have to think, the Fed funds rate was steadily heading down to zero. It had been for many years. They had raised interest rates in the early 80s up to, I forget where they had it peaked out at, but it was up a little over 15%. And over interest rates in the early 80s up to, I forget where they had it peaked out at, but it was up a little over 15%. And over the decades, as they were trying to stimulate where they had it peaked out at, but it was up a little over 15%. And over the decades, as they were trying to stimulate the economy, they would lower the Fed funds rate 5%, or around 5%. And however, they were getting very, very close to zero. And this is what Ben Bernanke had to say back in 2002. However, they were getting very, very close to zero. And this is what Ben Bernanke had to say back in 2002. I just lost it. Gosh, I'm terrible at this, guys. Okay, hold on. Let me bring it back up. There we go. Okay. Because central bank, this guys, okay, hold on. Let me bring it back up. There we go. Okay. Because central banks conveniently conduct monetary policy by manipulating the short-term nominal interest rates, again, this is what we were talking about, the Federal Reserves and their interest rate setting policies, some observers have concluded that when the key rate stands at or near zero, remember, it hadn't achieved it yet, but it was well on its way, right? The central bank has, quote, run out of ammunition. So this is the Federal Reserve hitting the lower bound of zero, right? This is what they call it, lower bound. Let me continue on. So the central bank has run out of ammunition. That is, it no longer has the power to expand aggregate demand and hence economic activity. So again, when they would lower interest rates, that would get the people out there borrowing money to buy houses and cars and go on vacation and all the wonderful things with that cheaper debt. Saying if you can't go any lower than zero, that's it. You're done. It's out of policy. It doesn't work anymore. Right? It no longer has the power to expand aggregate demand and hence economic activity. It is true that once policy rate has been driven down to zero, a central bank can no longer use its traditional means of stimulating aggregate demand. Back and just kind of read it again so it's clear. It's clear. It's true that once the policy rate, that is the Fed funds rate and how they adjust them, has been driven down to zero, meaning they can't go any lower, this is it, they hit the zero lower bound, a central bank can no longer use its traditional means, right, of stimulating aggregate demand and thus will be operating in less familiar territory. All right, so now we know that they are going to come to a moment in which they are going to say, hey, we can't do this anymore. We can't lower interest rates any further than where we're at because we have run into the lower bound of zero, and this is not going to be stimulating demand. All right. So in that speech, I'm not going to break it all down because I don't want, wow, we got, how many people do we have in here? Is there 636 people? Oh my gosh. Hey, wow. All right, man. Thanks everybody for joining in. This is wonderful. All right. All right, here we go. So anyway, in the speech, he continues to break down how to prevent deflation, like do whatever you can at all means necessary to try and prevent it, and he has a bunch of ideas on it. Now, I don't want to go necessarily through all those, but I do want to get to this part of the speech where he says, but suppose that despite all the precautions, and that is what he was just describing in the speech, deflation were to take hold in the U.S., or in the U.S. economy, and moreover, that the Fed's policy instrument, the Fed funds rate, will fall to zero. What then? See, now this is the problem that they were about ready to face back in 2002. Now remember, it hadn't happened yet, and this is like going to happen, and they knew it was going to happen. Let me continue on here a little bit. All right. He goes on to say this. So, curing deflation, how to prevent this from going any further, okay? Let me start with some general observations about monetary policy at zero bound, sweeping under the rug for a moment some technical and operational issues. As I have mentioned, some observers have concluded that when the central bank policy rate falls to zero, its practical minimum, monetary policy loses its ability to further stimulate aggregate demand and the economy. At a broad conceptual level, and in my view, in practice as well, this conclusion is clearly mistaken. Right? Saying once they hit the lower bound, and everybody says, hey, you're done with monetary policy, and it's no longer going to work anymore, he's saying, oh, no. Right? That is an idea that is clearly mistaken. Okay? Indeed, under a fiat, that is paper money system, a government, in practice, the central bank in cooperation with other agencies, should always be able to generate increased nominal spending and inflation, even when the short-term nominal interest rate is at zero. Now, this is really interesting to start to think about. It was like, okay, now hold on here, Ben Bernanke. right? So back in 2002, up until this point, you knew that you could always drop interest rates around 5% to stimulate the economy. But at this point, you knew that the lower bound was about to be achieved, and that stimulating the economy with the dropping of interest rates was no longer going to be an effective tool. And you said, that's cool. That's no problem, because we have this fiat paper money system, and we should always be able to generate inflation. How? Right? Now, this is very critical. This is where the important part of this speech kicks in. All right? If that wasn't already important enough, this is what he goes on to say. The conclusion that deflation is always reversible under a fiat money system follows from basic economic reasoning. A little parable may prove useful. Today, an ounce of gold sells for $300, more or less. Now suppose that a modern alchemist solves his subject's oldest problem by finding a way to produce unlimited amounts of new gold at essentially no cost. Moreover, his invention is widely publicized and scientifically verified, and he announces his intention to begin massive production of gold within days. What would happen to the price of gold? Presumably, the potentially unlimited supply of cheap gold would cause the market price of gold to plummet. Indeed, if the market for gold is to any degree efficient, the price of gold would collapse immediately after the announcement of the invention, before the alchemist has produced and marketed a single ounce of the yellow metal. What has this got to do with monetary policy? Like gold, U.S. dollars have a value only to the extent that they are strictly limited in supply. But the U.S. government has a technology called a printing press, or today its electronic equivalent, that allows it to produce as many U.S. dollars as it wishes at essentially no cost. By increasing the number of U.S. dollars in circulation, or even the credible threatening to do so, the U.S. government can also reduce the value of dollar in terms of goods and services, which is the equivalent to raising the prices in dollars of those goods and services. So now, to think about that for just a minute, it isn't even the production of the gold itself. It's the credible threat that this guy can do it. And that is how they were going to conduct themselves going into the future when it came to monetary policy. And it was in order to reverse a deflationary scenario. Now, when we think about what happened during quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4, this is right after the great financial crisis, many people, including myself, thought for sure we were going to have a hyperinflation scenario. The Federal Reserve had taken the balance sheet of $850 billion and expanded it to well over $4.5 trillion. Now, when you think about that as far as terms of percentages, easy for you to say, right? When you think about it in this fashion, the Federal Reserve had quadrupled the balance sheet, more than quadrupled the balance sheet. Just the COVID expansion doubled the balance sheet. But during the great financial crisis, it quadrupled it. Way more, as far as a percentage basis goes. And I knew we were going into a hyperinflation scenario. I knew it was going to destroy the dollar. I dumped all my money into silver because I knew it was going to happen. Now, a decade goes by, and it failed to produce the inflationary scenario. It didn't work. All that money printing didn't create an inflationary scenario. It caused asset prices to go up. I mean, the banks were loaded up on reserves, but if that money just sits in the bank, it doesn't chase goods and services. If people who borrow the money have first access to the money, they get to spend that money at face value. You start seeing things like stocks and bonds and real estate start to move up because those are the things that you borrow money to buy. But things like our wages and everything else that would typically have an inflationary scenario from all the money printing didn't quite occur in the Fed's eye, not in the way that they see it. Like we can, say, hey, it looks way different than that. Inflation is way more than that. Inflation is, 20%. Inflation is all kinds of things. But it's not really up to us to decide what inflation is. Not if we're trying to understand what monetary policy is. I mean, we can tell the Federal Reserve all day long, hey, you need to look at inflation this way or that way. But they look at it their way. And we can wish and hope and dream and pray that they're going to do it differently. They won't. They're not going to. So now, when I think about what it is that the Federal Reserve was going to do, considering that they had failed to achieve the 2% target, which is pretty interesting to think about how they came up with this target, from all the money printing that had occurred. Right? See, the hyperinflation scenario that we all thought was going to take place because of the quadrupling of the balance sheet that failed to manifest itself did have impact onto the economy. But by 2018, it was beginning to fail, and the Federal Reserve knew it. Now, I'm going to fast forward to another speech given by John Williams. John Williams is the New York Fed president. Now, this guy is incredibly influential, and you don't hear a lot of things that he does not come out and say much. This speech that he gave back in November 30th of 2018 was probably one of the most telling things that you could ever read about monetary policy and what was about ready to occur. This guy knew that we were going to have a situation in which that there was going to be inflation. Now listen, think about it. They could not produce an inflationary scenario considering all the money printing of quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 that expanded the balance sheet from $850 billion to well over $4.5 trillion, failed to produce an inflationary scenario. And John Williams had predicted an inflationary scenario in his speech given November 30th of 2018. Now, this speech is titled Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. Again, November 30th, 2018. The reason why I'm telling you the titles and the dates is so that you can go and check it for yourself. Like this is all stuff that is, you can just go and Google it yourself and pull the speeches. Now, in this speech, let me kind of give you a little bit of an idea. He talks about the neutral interest rate. Now, the neutral interest rate is the rate that is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. They're neutral, right? A lot of times they'll call it the natural rate. And there's a couple of different ones that people will refer to. They talk about like the neutral rate or the natural rate of employment or unemployment, however you want to look at it. And in this speech, he's talking about the neutral interest rate of like the Fed funds rate being neutral to the economy. And that gets a little complicated, but kind of stick with it because he does kind of explain it a little bit in here. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole speech. I'm just going to go through these highlighted spots that I have here. But it says here, today we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. Now, this is so important to remember because, again, this is 2018, right? Great financial crisis, massive amounts of money printing, historically low unemployment, right? Remember, this is like, historically low unemployment's taken place. All this should have been an inflationary scenario. And what does he say? That the Federal Reserve has a problem. Let's say, ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. And so you think about this. This is a problem they needed to solve. This is so, like, when I first read this speech, I read it right after he had given, excuse me. And if you go to my YouTube channel, gee whiz. If you go to my YouTube channel, there's you can find it in a playlist that I had done breaking down this particular speech just shortly after he had given it. And now I didn't understand anything that was going on in that speech at the time, but I kept rereading it over and over and over again. And it is so like telling of what was going on in the future, to think that back then that they had a problem with a persistently low inflation expectations, and that it was a problem that they needed to solve. They had no other choice. They had to solve this problem of a persistently low inflation. All right. I keep reiterating it because it was so important, and nobody really thinks about this. Like they think about how inflation has gone out of control or something of that nature. And I go back to the speech and I'm like, man, they needed the problem the problem they needed to solve was to have an inflationary scenario. Like that's what they wanted, according to John Williams. Here, let me go on to this part. It says, when a recession hits, central banks may not be able to reduce interest rates well below their neutral level to stimulate the economy as warranted because of the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates. Now, I know, again, this is really confusing stuff. And I know, like, I have been reading this stuff and breaking it down for a very long time. So for me, it's like it's so crystal clear. But it is confusing the way that they talk about this stuff. So let me read it again so that you can really hear what he's trying to say here. And it goes like this. He goes, when a recession hits, right? So when the economy slows down and they need to stimulate the economy by dropping interest rates, a central bank may not be able to reduce interest rates well below their neutral level. Now, here's the problem. That neutral interest rate was very close to zero. Very close to zero. So when the Federal Reserve dropped interest rates, they couldn't drop it well enough below, let me see, how does he say it? Below their neutral level to stimulate the economy as warranted because of the effective lower bound. The effective lower bound is zero. They kind of talk in code. Once you hear it and once you understand it, it's not so confusing anymore. And like when I explain it to you, you're like, oh, well, that's simple enough. Why don't they just say it that way? I don't know, right? I mean, they choose to do it so that you don't get it. This is communication to the other central bankers, by the way. They just don't talk like this to the mainstream media. This literally is communication that they are with the other central bankers at their conferences or meetings or whatever it is. It's available for you to read. I mean, I read all of them, but it is confusing. And if you're reading that and just didn't get it, that's what it essentially is saying, is that once the attempt to stimulate the economy and you lower interest rates to zero, but it's only just, very, very slightly below the neutral level, it doesn't stimulate the economy. In fact, there was predictions that they would have had to have the Fed funds rate like negative 6.5% in order to have it far enough below the neutral level during the great financial crisis in order to actually stimulate the economy. So hold on, let me take a drink of water. I'm talking too fast, guys. I guess I'm talking fast because I see it getting dark and I don't want to be like sitting in the dark, but I guess I'm going to be. All right. So let's continue on here. All right, so sticking with this speech, he goes on to say this. And this is again the 2018 speech before the inflationary scenario that we have experienced. This is what John Williams has to say. The downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. So again, the downward shift in inflation expectations, different from inflation. Inflation expectations, what you and I think and believe. That's what he's talking about right now. Not reality of anything else, just our thoughts, right? Think about and I bring this up because you got to think about the gold machine. Right? You got to remember this gold machine and how they are conducting themselves, because the effective lower bound is no longer allowing them to use monetary policy like we had remembered with the adjustment of the Fed funds rate. Right? Because Ben Bernanke already said it. Once you hit the lower bound at zero, that's not an effective tool. So moving on here, right? The downward shift, and this is back to the speech, the downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. So again, the expectation has an impact on inflation. When the policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, again, when the Fed funds rate hits zero, the downward shift in inflation expectation, think about that, the downward shift in inflation expectation, right, raises the real interest rates. This is very important to understand. The downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates. Now, for a lot of you, your probably mind is just spinning on this, so let me explain it really easy, okay? Imagine yourself as an investor. You are planning on getting a 2% return, right? Just real simple. You're going to get a 2% return. You have an inflation expectation of 1%. The real interest rate that you will get is 1%. After you have received your interest rate and made up for inflation, the real interest rate would be 1%. Now, if you lower the inflation expectation, you will raise the real interest rate to 2%, what the investor anticipates getting after inflation. If inflation is 0 and you have a 2% return, you will get 2%. If the inflation rate is 1%, you will get a 1% real return. Lowering the inflation expectation raises the real interest rate. Does that all kind of make sense? All right, that's important to remember, because what ends up happening is that when you, where was I here? I'm sorry. The downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. Okay, I'm going to read it again. This is, I know this is heavy stuff, right? When the policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, when the Fed funds rate hits 0, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. Even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation of below target inflation in the future affects current decision making. If your expectation of a low inflation rate, it will affect your current decisions, putting additional downward pressure on inflation. Like if you're not worried about inflation, why participate in a way that would actually create inflation? Because inflation is a self-fulfilling prophecy, both on the up and down side. If you believe things are going to get cheaper into the future, would you buy it today or would you buy it later on? Or if you had no fear of the prices going up, what would get you to buy it today? A fear of inflation. And by lowering the inflation expectation, you raise the real interest rates. If you raise the inflation expectation, you lower the real interest rates, and you get people to go out there and start taking part in the economy so that they can beat the inflationary scenario that is coming. This is part of how they trick the economy. So this is important. If you didn't quite get it, right? And I understand, like, again, this is really heavy stuff and nobody's going to explain this to you. Absolutely nobody. I mean, I cannot find anybody out there, not a single person. Not a single person is going to tell you this stuff, only me, right? I am the only one who has this credible threat theory dialed in like this. So let me read it again. And it's hard to internalize this stuff, right? But again, if you think about the inflation expectation, if you believe that the car is going to cost $20,000 next month, but $25,000 next year, would you buy the car today or would you buy it next year? You would probably buy it today. So your inflation expectation has a huge impact on the economy and the way that you behave. And if you can raise the inflation expectation, right, you will then get people to participate in the economy. You will get them to buy stuff ahead of time, which actually creates the inflationary scenario. Again, think about the gold machine and think about what it is that people's actions do. Okay. Oh, excuse me, guys. Okay. Let me go back here a little bit. Even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation of below target inflation in the future affects current decision making, putting down additional downward pressure on inflation. In other words, monetary policy is always swimming upstream, fighting a current of too low inflation expectation that interferes with achieving the target inflation rate. Do you hear what the problem was? That the monetary policy is always swimming upstream, fighting a current of too low of an inflation expectation that's interfering with achieving the target rate. This is the problem that they were facing. This is such like a major issue, considering that they had just expanded the balance sheet with an inflation expectation persistently pushed into the people, and it failed them. They could not achieve the 2% target. He goes on to say he has 3 different suggestions on how to deal with it. I'm not going to go through all 3 of them because I want to go into some more stuff here to prove this credible threat theory for you guys. Again, this is not stuff that you're going to get anywhere else. And it's like, I think about people who are just so misguided into some of their decision making by thinking it's like some other outside political, environmental, social, whatever. These guys have been talking about this stuff for a couple of decades, right? And once you have internalized it, you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Like, this is like your last warning. If you don't want to know anymore, I wouldn't go any further than this, because after this, you will never be able to see it any other way. All right. This is what he goes in to talk about. John Williams' speech dated November of 2018. This was his suggestion. The second option, this is how to deal with this problem of a too low inflation expectation that we just talked about, right? He says the second option is average inflation targeting, whereby the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation rate. Now, whoa, what in the world? You couldn't get a 2% target over the previous 10 years. Quantitative easing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Expansion of the balance sheet from $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion, and it failed to produce an inflationary scenario that even achieved the target of 2%. It did not work. And yet, what did he just say? That the central bank, right? The second option is average inflation targeting, where the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation in good times, when the lower bound is not constrained. Properly designed and implemented, such an overshoot can offset the inflation undershoot during bad times, so that the long-run average inflation rate and inflation expectations are in line with the target. Average inflation targeting. Right? How were they planning on doing that? That was amazing. Like, you were going to have an inflationary scenario in which that you can average over time, right, this 2% target. Not achieve a 2% target, because you failed to achieve a 2% target, even though you had a huge expansion of the balance sheet. It didn't work. Dun, dun, dun. COVID hits. Shutdowns, lockdowns. No way are you getting out of your house. Don't go to work. Don't distribute. Don't manufacture. Don't do any of that stuff. And by the way, here's a stimulus check. Go out there and spend that money as fast as possible and wipe out the inventory. And what do you think is going to happen? Supply demand imbalances and prices shoot through the roof. Bang. Well, let's think about what Jerome Powell had to say, because do you remember that the inflation didn't happen until started kicking in really good around 2021 going into 2022? But when it first happened, the COVID first kicked in, the lockdowns first kicked in, by the summer we were starting to see the stimulus packages, the issues that the stuff that the government was doing, right? They were in full swing. But the inflation really hadn't started yet. Right? It was just getting kicked in. The lockdowns and everything else were happening. This is going to Jerome Powell's speech given August 27th of 2020. What was it? February is like when COVID really started to happen. What was it? February, March, April, May, June, July. So 6 months. Yeah, 6 months into it, right? Remember, it's like people are freaking out. There's all kinds of stuff happening, right? But the true inflation hadn't really happened yet. It was getting started. Now, I'm not going to read through the whole speech again. I'm just going to go down to this part right here. This is hard. Wait, maybe I can use the keys. Yeah, hold on. Thank you for hanging with me, guys. I just kind of fumble through this stuff, but, you guys are patient, and I really appreciate that. We got quite a few of you up in here, too. What do we got? Like, I don't even know. How do I see? Is it up here? Is it like 1,000 likes? Is there 1,000 likes on this thing? Oh, my gosh. How many people? Can I read comments? I can. Can everyone please follow me so I can hit 2,000 and go live? Oh, I didn't know you. You don't have to hit 2,000. I'm live right now, right? I've only got like 700 or something. All right. Tap a comment. Moderators can do this too. Oh, wait a minute. That's something there. Okay. Is there any questions or comments or something? I see all kinds of people joined in. Did you break into this vehicle? Gosh. Okay. Well, I'm glad you guys are enjoying it. All right. Here we go. So going back into Powell's speech, August 27th of 2020. All right. This is what he has to say. And I'm not going to read the whole speech. I'm diving into the middle of it here. The persistent undershoot of inflation from a 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. All right. So remember, quantitative easing back in 2008, all the way through 2018, not creating the inflationary scenario they were looking for, and yet here Powell is still talking about it, even though COVID is kicking in. The persistent undershoot of inflation from the 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. Remember, Powell is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, okay? I'm sure most of you probably figured this out. Okay. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. Again, this hasn't happened yet. The inflation was just starting. The idea of it was just starting to take place with all the money printing and, the government actions and all the other stuff. It was like all that was just at the very beginning infancy of it, so it hadn't occurred. Right? So he was saying that the Fed would want to push up inflation. After all, this is back to Powell. After all, a low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy. And we are certainly mindful that higher prices for essential items such as food, gasoline, and shelter add to burdens faced by many families. So they're well aware of this. Like if there is an inflationary scenario that takes place, that the families are going to feel it. They know that it's going to be pain and suffering for them. Right? They say it right there, such as food, gasoline, shelter, add to the burdens faced by many families, especially those who are struggling with lost jobs and incomes. The people at the lower end, they suffer the most. However, it sucks to be you. However, inflation that is persistently too low can pose a serious risk to the economy. Right? So, however, despite, the feeling of being poor and, suffering, if we don't have an inflation that is persistently too low, it can cause a serious risk to the economy. Inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations. Again, major problem. They can't have you believing that there's going to be a low inflation going into the future. It doesn't work for them. All right? Falling long-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever low inflation and inflation expectations. Why are you thinking with inflation so low it doesn't work for the Federal Reserve? You must think with a higher inflation expectation. It's the only way it does it. It's the only way it's going to function. Continues on. It's kind of a long speech. Okay. And boom. All right. So this is right towards getting towards the end of the speech. And again, like, I'm kind of going through this information fairly quickly. Like, you follow me on my channel, we break this stuff down a lot. I do a memberships only. It's $1 a month. We talk about these Fed speeches like this on a continuous basis. We break down all of them so that you can actually understand what it is that they are communicating through them, and they are not communicated through the mainstream media. I don't care how many news articles you read, you will not find this information. I don't care how many other YouTubers you find, none of them seem to talk about this stuff. They never bring up these speeches, and when they do, they get it wrong. Right? And I don't mean to sound so arrogant with it, but that's the truth of the matter is there's nobody else who's breaking this stuff down like I am. All right? And I don't have anything to sell. I'm not even like $1 a month to be a member of my channel. It's not even like I'm charging anything for it. You know, I mean, $1. All right, here we go. This is what Powell has to say here. Okay. He says, we have made important changes with regard to the price stability side of our mandate. Our long-run goal continues to be inflation rate of 2%. The long-run goal. And that means way out there. Not right here. Not the inflation that we are experiencing. Way out there. Right? Bam. Our long-run goal continues to be an inflation rate of 2%. Our statement emphasizes that our actions to achieve both sides of the dual mandate will be most effective if the long-term inflation expectations remain well anchored at 2%. Right? The long-term inflation expectation of 2%. However, right? If inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, well, that sounds like the great financial crisis. It fell below 2% and never really achieved 2%. I hear what you're saying, old Powell. I know exactly what you're talking about the great financial crisis. Right? Again, right? However, if inflation runs below 2% following economic downturns, but never moves above 2% even when the economy is strong, then over time, inflation will average less than 2%. Households and businesses will come to expect this result, meaning that inflation expectations would tend to move below our inflation goal and pull realized inflation down. To prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement, this is the Federal Reserve, this is Jerome Powell, this is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and speaking on behalf of the policymakers of the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, this is what he has to say. To prevent this outcome and adverse dynamic that could ensue, our new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Right? Moderately above 2% for some time. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are not tying ourselves to any particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Did you hear that part? They are not going for a 2% target. They're going for 2% over time. And seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, they are not tying themselves to any particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, going back to the speech, our approach could be viewed as flexible form of average inflation targeting. Our decision about appropriate monetary policy will continue to reflect a broad array of considerations. It will not be dictated by any formula. Of course, if excessive inflationary pressures were to build, or inflation expectations were to ratchet above levels consistent with our goal, we would not hesitate to act. So now, do you see what's happened here? This is before the inflationary scenario hit. This was August 27th of 2020. Like, it was February of 2020, 6 months earlier that COVID was hitting. The inflationary scenario hadn't come yet. It was about ready to. It was approaching. The wheels were spinning, the money was going, the things were about ready to happen, but it hadn't happened yet. But yet here he is calling it out, predicting it, and saying things were about ready to happen, but it hadn't happened yet. But yet here he is calling it out, predicting it, and saying that it was going to take place and that they weren't going to have any mathematical formula for figuring out how this average inflation rate was going to work. Now, a lot of people might say, yeah, that was years ago. Things changed. It got, I don't know. You want to make up all kinds of stuff about it. That's fine. Saying that it's like outdated or something of that nature. I hear you. Okay. That's fine. I'm going to take you to April 5th, 2024. So April, May, June, July, August, September, October, 6 months ago. I had 6 months ago. Perfect. All right. So this is working out great. 6 months ago, Michelle Bowman, again, voting member of the FOMC. People say that Powell has all this power. No, he doesn't. He has one vote. He has a vote with 11 other people. That makes up the FOMC with 5 alternates and two advisors. Michelle Bowman is extremely influential when it comes to the FOMC and the monetary policy decisions. She puts out a lot of speeches. This particular one, April 5th, 2024, 6 months ago, titled Risks and Uncertainties in Monetary Policy, Current and Past Considerations. Now, in this speech, and again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, and she talks about she talks about all kinds of stuff. Like here, let me just break. There was also concern that the Fed funds rate, the FOMC key policy, was too close to the zero lower bound. See, they keep repeating the zero lower bound issues. Anyway, I'm not going to get into it. I just saw that as I was passing by. I really want to get to this part right here. All right, and again, this is 6 months ago she said this. Another notable change to the strategy statement, talking about their monetary policy. Another notable change to the strategy statement was the adoption of what some refer to as asymmetric flexible average inflation targeting. That's literally quoted. Asymmetric flexible average inflation targeting, or temporary price level targeting. Specifically, the new statement noted that in order to anchor long-term inflation expectations, again, it's all about what you're thinking, because just like the gold machine, remember how the gold machine works, right? In order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at its 2% goal, its 2% goal, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. All right? Very much like what they have been saying for a while. Like this is, 6 years now that they have been saying the same thing way before the inflation. Right? Saying that, hey, we need an inflationary scenario because it's persistently too low rather than too high, and now they got it. And appropriate monetary policies saying that 2% appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. The revision to the FOMC statement focused on monetary policy in a world of a structurally low interest rate, disinflationary forces, and an apparent insensitivity of inflation to the low levels of unemployment. See, they couldn't get it back in the day. Even with a historically low inflation or unemployment. Remember, Donald Trump boasted about it. Talked about all the jobs that were created under his administration, and there's no inflation. The Fed should be printing money. He said that shit, right? All right. Although the revised statement reaffirmed the commitment to the committee's inflation target, it did not describe how the committee would respond if inflation were to run persistently above the 2% goal. It's not. It's moderately above 2%, very much in line with what it is that they were looking for. All right? And this was stated 6 months ago. Like, not even that long ago. And so as people are like, saying, oh, no, man, they're flying by the seat of their pants. They don't know what they're doing. They screwed up. They're behind the curve, all that other stuff. No, this is a well-orchestrated, laid-out plan that nobody sees except for me. Me and my followers, the people who are actually following this credible threat theory, we're the only ones who see it. Us and the other people that are communicating to the other central bankers through the FOMC, but they're certainly not telling the public. They certainly don't talk about it in any kind of mainstream media article. In fact, the mainstream media will have you believe that the Fed is going for a 2% target and that they are attempting to get inflation down to 2%. They do not communicate how they're moderately above 2% is the appropriate monetary policy. Uh-oh. I got something going on here. Live will end in 4.5 minutes. Uh-oh. Oh, wait a minute. I see what I got to do here. Oh, come on. Get back in there. Boom. Okay. Haha. All right. I'm starting to figure out TikTok. I'm getting you now. How many people? We got 1,400 likes. How many people are watching? How do I find that? I don't understand how any of this works. I don't even know how to end it. I guess I end it right up there. Okay. Well, this is so awesome. You guys are rad. Thank you for hitting that like if that's what you have been doing or whatever it is that makes this thing happen, because this is my very first TikTok live that I've ever done. So I appreciate you all being here. Okay, I think we're done with this speech. Now, what else do I want to make up strategy? This is a good one. Now, you can find this one out there on the internet. It's from Finance and Economics Discussion Series, Division of Research and Statistic and Monetary Affairs, Federal Reserve Board, Washington, D.C. Okay. Big old deal about it. Basically, this came out, I believe, again in 2020, August of 2020. And I think all you really have to do is type in makeup strategies, August of 2020, and Federal Reserve, and you'll probably find it just under that. The title, I believe, is How Robust, if you wanted to search a title, How Robust Are Makeup Strategies to Key Alternative Assumptions? This is a really good working paper. Now, I'm not going to even get into it because it's 42 pages long, but this really breaks down the credible threat. Like how the credible threat really impacts. It's the forward guidance. It's the words that they use. And this really talks about it. Let me see here. Yeah, in fact, this is the paragraph I wanted. Okay, I was hoping to find it right away. I wasn't going to make you sit through it, but this is I think the paragraph that I really wanted to read so that it would encourage you to go and look at this information for yourself, right? It says this: makeup strategies work best when the public understands, believes, and reacts to the policymakers' commitment to offset misses in the inflation from the 2% objective in the future. So again, think about the credible threat theory. Think about the gold machine that Ben Bernanke talked about. The public understanding, right? When the public understands, believes, and reacts to policymakers' commitment. That means they haven't done anything. They committed to doing something in the future. Right? Committed to offset misses in inflation from the 2% objective in the future. In particular, makeup strategies are most powerful when policymakers can influence the public's inflation expectations. So important to understand. Again, this is directly from the Federal Reserve talking about the makeup strategies when they failed to achieve the 2% target from post the great financial crisis going all the way up to COVID. They needed to have a strategy to make up for that. This is it. They break it down into 42 pages that you would have to read yourself or follow the Uneducated Economist, because we basically know this information from all the things that we have already researched. But it says it right here. In particular, makeup strategies are most powerful when policymakers can influence the public's inflation expectation. In doing so, policymakers face a dynamic tension. They must maintain long-run inflation expectations around 2% objective, while at the same time moving shorter-run inflation expectations in response to new strategy. Given the centrality of these expectations, our paper begins by surveying some empirical evidence. Measures of long-run inflation expectations appear to be well anchored. However, recent evidence from survey also suggests that long-run inflation expectations respond to persistent changes in realized inflation and could therefore become unanchored if the current low inflation environment persists. Think about this. They need volatility. If they don't have volatility, they could lose the long-run inflation expectation. It can fall too low. But if they keep the volatility, if they keep you believing that it's going to run high, it's too low, it's too high, it's too low, or whatever, they can get you to believe get you to believe in such a way that they can anchor the long-term inflation. They admit it right there. Measures of long-run inflation expectations appear to be well anchored. However, recent evidence from surveys also suggests that long-run inflation expectations respond to persistent changes in realized inflation and could therefore become unanchored if the current low inflation environment persists. Persists. There we go. On short-run inflation expectations, a body of research has documented that these expectations seem to react to new information more slowly and to lesser extent than assumed in most theoretical models. That's why you hear so much about it. It's not a little bit of news, it's a lot of news that you hear. And they have developed ways of communicating that. That's actually done in another speech. All right? Let me see if I can find that one here. Waller. Is that the one? No, that's The Time Has Come. Sorry, guys. Anyway, I'm sorry. I don't have that speech lined up here. But they are a working paper, or was it a speech? I can't remember. No, it was a speech. So many documents, right? Talking about how it is that they communicate. Like they have ways of communicating to different people because they know if they communicate like in a particular way to a bunch of bankers and they communicate that way to like a bunch of teenagers or a bunch of like young women or even young men or something like that, they're not going to get it. Like they have to like gear this for each individual class and group of people so that everybody gets the communication. Because just because they put it out there doesn't necessarily mean people are going to receive it. So they have to put it out there in a way that everybody is going to receive it, even the people who typically would not want it. Like they get it anyway. They talk about that. They talk about how they communicate that stuff out there. Alrighty, guys. Let me see. I want to keep going on this stuff, but I think that probably should be a good overload for everybody there. Those speeches that I give, the Ben Bernanke speech from November of 2002, Deflation and How to Prevent It from Ever Occurring, Powell's speech, August 27th of 2020, and John Williams' speech, Monetary Policy for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. If you go through those three speeches, if you really internalize everything that they are saying within it, you will have no other choice. You will have no other choice but to see it this way, because this is truly this strategy coming from the Federal Reserve. Everybody else got it wrong. Like I was one of the few people who was calling out lumber when it was at its all-time high of $1,700 per thousand. Everybody, literally everybody I knew was pointing at lumber saying, money printer go burr, prices go up. And I was the only person out there, and believe me, lumber made me very popular on the YouTube channel for being able to call out shortages and price increases. And it was at its height, it was at its peak. And I was saying it's going to go back down to normal prices. something that we had experienced pre-COVID, and we have been there for well over a year now. I absolutely nailed it. I knew this because of what I understand of the monetary policy, and you can understand it too. And the thing is that what most people don't understand is having a working class job, like a 9-to-5 working class job, where you're busting your neck, building, driving, serving, doing whatever it is out there. You have no idea how close to the cutting edge of information you really have. Once you understand macroeconomics, once you understand the Federal Reserve's monetary policy, once you start to get it, really understand it, not with the political view, because that just does nothing but cloud your mind when it comes to understanding this for a longer term, especially considering that this theory goes back decades, and I can care less who's the administration. This theory blasts right through them. But once you have truly internalized this information, you will start to make decisions for yourself that will then elevate you. I guarantee you, many people have come to me so much and said, dude, thank you, man. Thank you for all the information you put out there. It makes so much sense now. I am able to go forth with confidence in what it is that I am doing. And that's the point of this, all right? It's not all about monetary gain. It's about making the right decisions for yourself. And that's really what this comes down to, because most people look at the Federal Reserve and they say, you screwed up, you don't know what you're doing, you have no clue. And they do. They're doing that on purpose, and they use that information against you. Think about this. Every single person who thought that in hyperinflation scenarios about ready to tear the world apart benefited the Federal Reserve. That's what the Federal Reserve needed you to think, and it worked. And that's what's scary about it, is that I figured it out, but nobody else seems to have figured it out. And it's through their own words. I'm not making this stuff up. You can go and do this research for yourself. I mean, go and follow my channel, and you can go and be a member of the channel where we break down these speeches, these exact words coming from the Federal Reserve. All right, guys, what else do we got here? Can everyone please follow? Oh, we already did that one. How do I get to the comment section? Where is that at? Are you guys even commenting? I see 1.5K up there. Is that how many people have liked it? How many people are in the chat right now? All right. Nah, you like Walls and Kamala? Who does? Ugh, all right. Wait, so you like Vance? Who's like what? All right. LARPing, goodbye. All right. Okay, guys, well, I don't know how to use this, but I just wanted to come out here and at least give a try on the live stream to see what would come from it. I hope you guys enjoyed the live stream. I hope you enjoyed the credible threat theory. Again, this is something that I break down on a regular basis. I try to show evidence of it as I see it come up in the mainstream media. Once you recognize it, once you see it, it's very difficult to unsee this thing. And I know a lot of information was presented here in a very short amount of time. But again, this isn't so deep that it's impossible. Information was presented here in a very short amount of time. But again, this isn't so deep that it's impossible to finally get or understand for yourself. And a lot of times, when we try to, go and research a lot of this stuff, they communicate in a way that seems like it's code. Once you break that code, once you crack the code, it's very telling. It's very telling stuff. So, all right. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to call it quits. Uneducated Economist. You guys let me know. I think I'm going to call it quits.